All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to the University of Central Arkansas virtual event for National Day of Racial Healing, which is offered through the Conway Conversations Dialogue Initiative. And it's part of a week-long statewide celebration here in Arkansas, spearheaded by the Arkansas Peace and Justice Memorial Movement. So my name's Leslie Graybeal. I'm the Director of Service Learning at UCA. I'm part of our Conway Conversations team, and just introducing the event and getting us started here. So the National Day of Racial Healing was created by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation to take place on the day after Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, as an opportunity for truth-telling, listening, and initiating action to address the broken systems in our communities and work towards racial justice. So this event will feature 3 UCA faculty and staff whose perspectives we hope will ignite small group dialogue on the topic of revisiting broken systems. And I'm very excited to introduce them to you in just a moment. So following our 3 speakers, we will take a few minutes for any follow-up questions or clarification. And then we're going to move into breakout groups, which will have small group discussions. So we're talking about race in America. And so, yes, we are going to have so much more to discuss than we could possibly cover in these 90 precious minutes this evening. But we do hope to accomplish some outcomes of listening, sharing perspectives, and understanding differences, building relationships and trust, and affirming the inherent value of all people. And we also hope to leave this evening inspired to act and with a plan of action for our current moment and our local communities. So one last thing before I introduce the first speaker, I want to thank the UCA Outreach staff who are helping to run this event, and the members of the Conway Conversations planning team who are here, and the numerous AmeriCorps members who are joining this event from their communities as well as from here in Conway. Thank you so much for your commitment to this event and to service. So first, I would like to introduce Dr. Taine Duncan, Associate Professor and Chair of the UCA Department of Philosophy and Religion and Director of the Gender Studies Program, to speak about CRT and critical theories of race, how political philosophy can help us identify and resolve structural inequities.
Okay, let me make sure. Can y'all hear me and also see the screen? Perfect. So thank you so much, Leslie, for inviting me to be a part of this amazing panel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the framework, and Dr. Carter and Dr. Massey are going to follow up and talk about some really specific examples. And we hope that this sort of combination of talking about the framework and giving us kind of a shared vocabulary, and then working through some specific research and some specific experiences will help to ignite a variety of conversations. One of the things that I think is really important when we have a conversation about CRT or critical race theory is to make sure that we're clearly defining it. The kind of popular conversation around CRT right now has become very politicized, and in a way that actually keeps us from having real conversations about the heart and the meaning of the discourse and how it can be used in practice, right? That to me is really the worst part of not being able to have a genuine conversation about CRT. So I've kind of synthesized together a variety of definitions, and this is the definition that I generally work from when I introduce the idea of CRT in classes or to community groups. It is first and foremost a legal philosophy. It was developed by several law professors, legal practitioners, and scholars. specifically in response to the ways in which civil rights gains had failed to ensure racial equity under the law. I'm going to talk about some specific figures, but Derek Bell looms large in conversations of CRT, and he's a perfect example of showing this. He was a legal practitioner who actually worked on civil rights cases, saw the shortcomings of the outcome of those cases, went into teaching at Harvard Law and other law schools, and then saw that there were problems within academic institutions as well. All of his work, though, was centered around changing structures and systems that contributed to ongoing racism and racial disparity. So one of the things that's really important about this definition that you'll see here too is that legal remedy cannot be achieved without understanding the historical roots of racism or without fundamentally addressing what are called de jure and de facto racism and political, legal, and social practice. De jure means racism under the law, or just under the law in general. So this is things like specific policies, specific laws that are unfairly applied to different racial groups. So for example, one of the other founders of critical race theory, Kimberly Crenshaw, worked to show that anti-discrimination lawsuits to help employees to respond to discrimination in the workplace were being unfairly applied to Black women, right? So that's a really specific example of de jure practice of racism. De facto means not just in the law or how the law is written, but in everyday practice. That's basically the ways in which the political and legal structures and the things that we might sort of abstractly call institutions actually influence our day-to-day lives. And for Derek Bell and the other founders of critical race theory, there was a connection between these two, that racism and inequity in the law would contribute to racism and inequity in practice, and that the experiences of racism and inequity in everyday life would continue to support racist systems or institutions under the law, right? There's this sort of reciprocal engagement between both the law and everyday experience. CRT was and is critical of other legal theories, including liberalism, that try to use policies of colorblindness. So colorblindness is an idea or an approach that can kind of be summed up like, oh, I'm not racist because I just don't see race, right? I don't acknowledge that as a way of understanding differences. I want to try to treat everybody just purely equally. CRT said this is a problem because if we don't acknowledge racial discrimination and racism when we see it, we're never going to be able to actually create new, fair, and equitable systems. CRT was and is also very critical of constitutional originalism, which is more a legal theory than maybe a practical theory, but you can see that it also influences the way that we have conversations around CRT. Constitutional originalism really loosely just means the idea that the text of the Constitution or the text of our founding documents is literal and we should follow it exactly word for word, and that there's no historical sort of situation that changes the meaning. Derek Bell and other scholars pointed out that the law has always been informed by what is going on in the particular day and time that the law is applied, that laws are always interdependent on the real lived experiences of citizens under the law. So one way of putting this is that the text had historical realities of racism built in, right? So CRT really specifically is this legal theory that is founded on changing structures and institutions of racism, but also founded on understanding the real lived experiences of racism in order to create that change. Oh, trying to advance slides the wrong way, apparently. So the first person that I want to mention in kind of giving that background to critical race theory, I already mentioned briefly, is Derek Bell. He's considered the founding scholar of critical race theory. He also developed the idea of historical situatedness, which is the idea that our policies, our practices, our laws, they don't come out of nowhere. They don't come out of thin air. Instead, they are built upon the history that has led us to this point. And conversely, what we do now is going to influence the future. So there's a responsibility to both understand the past and to actively try to change the future to make the future better, right? Historical situatedness has that idea built in. He also believed that critical race theory was radical in that it called for people to, or it calls for people to, he's no longer living, so I'm using the past tense here, but critical race theory itself is very much alive. But he says that it calls for people to make huge changes, that we have to really get at the roots of our problems and imagine a radically different way of being more equitable in society. At the same time, he felt that it was radically grounded. And what that means is that it is grounded in the real lived experiences people face day to day in racist discrimination. It's not based on abstraction or conjecture. It's based on real lived experience. In one of his most famous works, which I've referenced here, Who's Afraid of Critical Race Theory, was a direct response to the popular work, The Bell Curve. He was talking about how understanding critical race theory could help not only institutions like the legal system, but also institutions like academia. Unexpectedly for many of us who think, oh, academia, that can be transformed from the inside, but not unexpected for folks who know that academic institutions are still institutions. Derek Bell actually lost his position several times due to racism in the system. He was actually fired from Harvard because he was advocating for other Black female scholars to be hired at Harvard Law. So you can really see this work being put into practice, even in the lived experiences of the scholars who developed it. This is just a representation of that idea of historical situatedness. This is actually a way that I think critical race theory can be talked about pretty clearly and easily and more accessibly, even though the overarching system might be very technical and legal. Historical situatedness is something that we can talk about and kind of understand. Even in our day-to-day lives as individuals, we often think about how I'm in this position at this moment, being invited to give a talk because of research I've done in the past. And what I'm doing right now is going to change what I do next week in the classroom, right? So we can see in our day-to-day life that historical situatedness is part of how we live our everyday lives. Derek Bell says this is also how we should think about systems in order to promote transformation. Kimberly Crenshaw is another founder of critical race theory. She's actually credited with coining both the term critical race theory and the term intersectionality, which is another maybe hot button topic or hot button term that we don't have very effective conversations around. Her concept of intersectionality was based on the work that she did. I mentioned Black women facing discrimination in the workplace and not being accounted for under the law. This was based very directly on cases she had where her clients were asked to either sue on the basis of discrimination for race or sue on the basis of discrimination for gender, but were told that they couldn't sue on the basis of discrimination for being both race and gendered, right? Being at that intersection of being a Black woman. And Kimberly Crenshaw recognized through this practice and advocating for her clients in the courtroom that this was something that we needed to think about and flesh out and develop a vocabulary around. And now the term intersectionality is used in online discussion boards and forums, right? It's become a part of our everyday language. One other critical race theorist I want to mention who is a more contemporary, so he wasn't one of the founders, but a really important voice in critical race theory is Tommy Curry. One of the things that Tommy Curry advocates for is that it's really important to avoid abstraction in critical race theory. He argues that introducing too much theory into any discussion of racism and inequality is going to just perpetuate the lived experiences of racism and inequality. So what that means for a conversation like today is that it's helpful for us to have this shared vocabulary. But if we get too wrapped up in saying, oh, that's what this term means, or this term means, or this idea has this specific definition, and we forget that the reason why those definitions matter is because of the real lived experiences of racism, we're doing a disservice to critical race theory, right? That's not critical race theory then. We can get too wrapped up in the conversation and forget to act. Tommy Curry, much like Derek Bell, has also faced a lot of personal discrimination for many of his ideas. He actually had to flee the United States and is now in Edinburgh, Scotland as a scholar because of death threats his family faced for having some difficult conversations about issues of racism and discrimination for Black men. One other thing that's really important that I want to acknowledge too before I turn it over to Dr. Carter is that there is a distinction between critical race theory and what are called critical theories of race. I think it's really important to acknowledge that first, because as a white woman, I can't reflect on experiences of anti-Black discrimination. I don't have those experiences. And for critical race theory, understanding and acknowledging the experiences and how they inform the law was a really fundamental component to critical race theory, right? I don't have that, I can't offer that. On the other hand, something that I can bring to the conversation is a perspective and experience of what whiteness has meant to my experience. And critical theories of race is a framework that allows that aspect of the conversation. It's something that also focuses on a concept of emancipation, which is the idea of trying to generate liberation, freedom, and equity for as many groups and as many populations as we can. So this is really my area of research. This is what I teach. I teach a course called Critical Theories of Race, and this is my background in my research as a scholar. And I was very fortunate to learn under some really fantastic scholars in critical theories of race, like George Yancy, who introduces the idea of Parrhesia, which is brave or fearless speech, which is exactly what we're engaged in today in Conway Conversations. So with that, I actually want to go ahead and turn the mic over to, well, actually probably Dr. Rabiel first to introduce Dr. Carter, and then Dr. Carter.
Thanks so much. All right, so thanks for that, laying that groundwork for us, Dr. Duncan. And I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Kristy Carter, who's the Director of Marketing in UCA's Division of Outreach and Community Engagement, to speak about fixing broken entrepreneurial ecosystems for women of color.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Kristy. It's great to be here. Thank you all for being here with us this evening. It's an important conversation. I'm looking forward to the breakout sessions following our presentations. Thank you, Taine, for laying the groundwork for this presentation. And Leslie, Rule, all of Outreach, thank you. Before I go into my presentation, I think it's important for me to let you know that these are my thoughts based on my own personal research and not necessarily the views of the University of Central Arkansas. So I just want to put that out there and be clear about the research that I plan to share with you today. To give the interpreters an opportunity to really focus on what I'm saying, I'm going to go off screen while I'm doing my presentation, so that they can focus on that and I can focus on what I want to tell you tonight. So bear with me. I'm going to share my slides with you. So for those of you who are familiar with my work, I started with a study on women of color business owners and entrepreneurs in Arkansas. And this was a project commissioned by the Women's Foundation. We conducted this study last year, when we took 107 women of color, and we wanted to learn more about their lived experiences, to Taine's point about the importance of lived experiences when we are considering the approach of critical race theory and how it relates to entrepreneurship. So this study, I will share the link with you in the chat so you can read about it later. But it's definitely something that I think everyone should look into if you're interested about all of those lived experiences and what women actually go through as entrepreneurs every day in the state of Arkansas. That's a very powerful presentation of their experiences, and videos are also embedded in this study, and you can learn more about them. But for tonight, I'm going to focus primarily on my research, which which encompasses entrepreneurial ecosystems for women of color. So if you look at this picture here, you can see this is my interpretation of an entrepreneurial ecosystem. Is basically a woman starting off through a series of mazes, almost like a game of life, right? And there's so much that she will endure throughout her journey to get to the finish line. And how many of you actually know women who are business owners in Arkansas, or anyone who started their own business? Talk about in the chat the different experiences that they go through. Before we go too far into entrepreneurial ecosystems, I think it's important for me to give you just a general idea of what entrepreneurial ecosystems are. I subscribe to Dale Gines' research on entrepreneurial ecosystems, which is this system. Of course, this is the root word. The root word is system. And it encompasses the capital capacity or capability of the entrepreneur, those various connections and resources that are in the system, the culture and climate. So some of you who are actually on this call tonight are part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem that support men, women in their local businesses and local economies. What I want to talk to you and impress upon you is, in my research, we actually found that capital and culture happen to be two of the areas within the entrepreneurial ecosystem where we can improve as a state with regard to Black women or women of color. And some of our participants, we have 37 participants who actually provided us with narratives of their experiences. And we coded to understand how those experiences related to the 5 factors or the facets within the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And we found that capital is the #1 barrier, but I know you guys probably already knew that capital and access to capital is the one barrier that women of color say they experience. And we also have a problem with culture in Arkansas. One of the participants said that I find that people are not forthcoming with helping, and there are lots of silos. So that in and of itself, in her experience, indicated that within the entrepreneurial ecosystem, there's more work to do to create a culture where Black women are valued, not just welcome, but where they are valued and in the system. To further support that, we looked at or asked questions about their perceptions of entrepreneurial support that the Black women in my particular study experienced. If you see that 49, almost 50%, you can just say 50% of those participants said that none of the traditional entrepreneurial support organizations that you would typically see in an entrepreneurial ecosystem support them. That some of that support comes from elsewhere. And we call the elsewhere in my field those sub-ecosystems. And that is a concept that Dr. Dale Gines, who was my mentor, also poses. So these sub-entrepreneurial ecosystems actually pop up in various locations to help support the Black women entrepreneurs in those areas. So think about it like this. If they don't have the support traditionally in the current existing entrepreneurial ecosystem, the community and economic development practice that that typically would support them, there has to be some other type of subsystem that supports these women. I wanted to share with you also the barriers that I found in the study. I think it is fitting for our conversation today because, as Dr. Duncan mentioned earlier, racial bias and discrimination are those areas and barriers that we must address and acknowledge, but they're not as easily fixed. So of course, access to capital is the first one. We have the cash flow, credit worthiness, gaining access to markets, and then the racial bias and discrimination. And if you pay attention to my little graphic here, you can see Wonder Woman. I always think of Black women and women of color in business as being Wonder Women based on their experience, because they're constantly in this state of transition, this state of transformation. They're also in a state of fighting for their credibility and perceived legitimacy. So they're in and out, they're code switching, they're doing all the things necessary to combat those barriers that exist within the entrepreneurial ecosystem and that will allow them to thrive. So the question goes back to you, the audience. Think about these barriers. Think about the bias. Think about the discrimination. And think about ways in which the system continues to perpetuate those attitudes and what we can do about it. That's why we're here tonight. So ultimately, the goal should be of any system, whether it's an entrepreneurial ecosystem or any system that goes to support those who are marginalized or, or who need the support the most. We want to create this symbiotic relationship among the entrepreneurial ecosystem and among the various domains that support the entrepreneur. So think about that. This image depicts that synergy and that symbiosis that I hope we will be able to see in the entrepreneurial ecosystem as we move forward. I'm excited to continue to share my research with you. And if you have questions, we'll talk more about them at the end of our conversation. So I'm going to turn my presentation over to Dr. Graybill so she can set the stage for Dr. Massey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter. So excited to say that and for you to share your research with everyone. And I'm pleased to complete our panel with Dr. Marsha Massey, Assistant Professor of Chemistry, who will be speaking about confronting bias in STEM education, reflections of a Black chemist.
Hi, can people hear me? Thank you. I would like to say thank you to Dr. Graybill, Dr. Taine Duncan, Dr. Kristy Carter for introducing me and including me in this conversation. I will be honest up front. I'm going to make this personal. This is not my scholarly work. I'm a chemistry instructor, although I do have a lot of interests, personal and professional, in promoting success for students and the population I work with as an educator. So I think those themes are throughout what Dr. Duncan and Dr. Carter mentioned. So I do feel at home here, even though it's my first time having this kind of a conversation. So I'm going to start by telling stories. I call this a reflection. So this gets at what Dr. Duncan talked about, making it personal by reflecting on lived experiences. So I'll share experiences. I admit I will refrain from giving too much of a firm opinion on what happened, but describe what happened. And I hope in describing what happened in less of my feelings that you may be able to find some of yourself in it and find some ways you can discuss it, even if you don't find much of yourself in these situations. So these are anecdotes or illustrations from my life to reflect on revisiting or broken systems and the things that I saw. I want to start with big picture. I know how to advance my slides. Here we go. Where I came from and some thoughts of my childhood. I was not raised to think that being Black would be a problem. I can do anything that I was willing to work hard for and to accomplish. I say that though, my parents, they didn't raise any fools, as you may have heard. I was taught that although my race wouldn't be a problem, I might have challenges, and those challenges would be different for me compared to my best friend, for example, who happened to be a white woman. My brother learned that he would have different challenges for me. He's a Black man. So we did know that we would all have differences in how we went through life. Even though this wasn't how I was raised to think of race as something that could define my future, I caught myself wondering or thinking that sometimes regardless. So if I wasn't raised that way, where did those doubts come from? And what I mean by doubts are some of the questions that are listed here that some of you may have asked of yourself before. Do I belong here? Am I good enough? Do the people around me care about the same things that I care about, have the same interests that I have? And to be clear, yes, each of these questions, when I was asking them, I was asking, is me being Black? Do I belong here because I'm Black? Am I good enough because I am Black? I don't know. So where did this doubt come from is what I wanted to ask myself when I was invited to give this talk. That's one thing that I was thinking about. Why do I have these hesitations? And that's where the stories that I like to share with you today come from. So I'll start with one example from my senior year of high school. I was very engaged in high school. I was a bit of a nerd. I like to challenge myself. I like puzzles and problem solving. So I really loved my math and chemistry classes. And like a lot of students in that scenario, I wanted to be a medical doctor. And I learned overhearing conversations, things that came up, medical doctors go to college and get a college degree. So that was the next step. And I heard about good colleges in my state. And so in particular, I wanted to go to the college that had a good medical program. It was a private college, and college is expensive. I honestly don't recall learning about college and scholarships from my high school counselors. When I think back on it, I try to recall having any conversations with my high school counselors. But I was fortunate enough that I talked with people in my classes. My best friend happened to be in a lot of my classes with similar interests. They told me about what they were learning from their parents who went to college. Their parents were involved in fields that were closer to STEM relation. And so I followed in my best friend's footsteps and those classmates. And that's how I found my way towards figuring out where to apply, what do I need. But I was a little surprised in this process that other students were telling me about what their counselors were telling them. And I was like, oh, okay. So it was weird, but I'll leave that as it is. I didn't hear these things from my counselors. So that was high school me. My first year of college, I didn't make it. I was excited to be a chemistry major. I was confused though, because I showed up to talk with my academic advisor, and my advisor was a very wonderful faculty member in music. So we were both confused. They had no idea how to help me with a schedule for a chemistry major. I didn't know what happened. And when I asked about what happened, the administration was like, we're not sure what happened to your paperwork. Your major was blank. So we assigned you a music instructor because you took orchestra in high school also. And I was like, okay. So they did their best. They were my advisor of record. I met with them for the whole year. But when it came time to register for my second semester, I wanted to enroll in chemistry, calculus, and biology, standard for that major. My advisor, however, thought that would be too difficult and was very, very hesitant and concerned about the idea of taking 2 sciences and a math in the same semester for my first year. So needless to say, they didn't allow me to register for biology. They were like, you're a chemistry major, chemistry, yes. Calculus, okay, you have to have that, but the biology you should wait on. And so I felt behind my peers in my first year. I remember they took that biology class and said great things about it. And if I'm being honest today, if there are conversations about biology topics, I lack a lot of confidence in those and I'll steer clear if I can. Related or not, that's how I felt about it. And then my last year of college is the other story I would like to point out. In my senior year, I had a chemistry department faculty member as my advisor. I asked about graduate programs. I shifted from medical doctor to I was interested in graduate school. I wanted to be a college professor. And at the first, my advisor dismissed that idea because I asked about a master's, bachelor's program that was at the college, and they're saying, no, that's for people who want to teach at the high school level. I don't think you're interested in that. And so I looked into PhD programs. A little disappointed that my advisor didn't tell me more about those programs or even encourage me to apply to certain programs or departments. I remember doing a lot of research and starting with rankings and things like that. And I did wonder if maybe they didn't share these things with me because they were worried. Was I ready for that? I admit I had a lot of C's in my upper level classes. And for the record, I am proud of those C's. They were not easy to earn while working 3 jobs and taking physical chemistry. I did what I had to offset tuition costs. So that is fine by me. But it would have been nice to have some advice from my advisor, especially since they were a chemistry faculty member, especially when I was accepted into a PhD program. I would have liked to hear about what can I expect when I get there. So I didn't get much of that, but they were shocked and excited for me. So these things, these experiences I had, they're snapshots of where I think our academic system can have some broken parts, some cracks in it is how I would phrase it. I like to see myself as a faculty and other faculty and staff across the nation less helpful in the sense, focus less on helping and being cautious for students and worrying and listening to the passions of the students. I wish the high school counselors had saw me more and I heard the same opportunities as my classmates. I wish that music professor, instead of worrying so much for me and trying to help me by not registering for biology, had empowered me. They could have given me advice on how to approach a science heavy term or pointed me to resources on campus for that. My chemistry advisor, they might have been worried about me, but it would have been nice if I had their support from the start, and their encouragement, or at least their support about getting into the program. So summarizing the goals I have as a faculty member and what I hope others will have in academia would be to empower students instead of always trying to help them. And then offering support, I think, would go a long way. Instead of just trying to be cautious and cut things off before they happen. We don't know the future and what it holds for any of us. And so I want to close too with some reflections for students. Empower yourself to ask questions. You can have several mentors. There's no limit to those. Seek several different types of mentors for that matter, and supporting each other. I did have a lot of support from peers. That's part of how I got here. It wasn't all faculty members and others. So don't be afraid to support one another. And if nothing else, you see that I didn't stop, even though I thought I was hearing cues to not do the things I was doing, whether those were true or not. I pursued my major in chemistry. I earned my PhD in chemistry. And now I try to do what I can for our system. I try to empower others and support others to find their passions and dreams. So this is my method to try and repair what I see as cracks in our system. And I know we're going to go to breakout rooms after this. So I thought I'd end with a question about what are some things that you might do? What are some actions we might have that we can as a community do inside or outside of academia to support one another, no matter our background?
Thank you so much, Dr. Massey, especially for ending our panel on a personal note, and for sharing all of those personal reflections with us. And I saw, I'm sure a lot of you